Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome to the Chicago Brewseum virtual happy hour. Great. Okay, my name is Lucas Livingston. I'm on the board of directors of the Chicago Brewseum, and I am very pleased to welcome for our virtual happy hour this hour, Dr. Christina Wade. Christina is a professor at Trinity College in Dublin, and a member of the Chicago Brewseum's League of Historians. And she has a specialty in Irish brewing history with a bit of an emphasis also on the women in Irish brewing history and the Viking era as well, also specializing in medieval era. And you'll find her blog online at brachyatrix.com. I don't know, Christina, if I'm pronouncing that right. The Latin, I understand, for the alewife, which I'm sure you'll be getting into. Very exciting. So certainly, without further ado here, I'm really happy to introduce Christina and pass things on over to you, please.
Yeah, so I did my PhD at Trinity. I'm not actually at Trinity.
Okay, thank you for clarification.
I'm an independent scholar. Woo! Right. So actually, behind me, I have a picture of Saint Brigid. I took this when I was in Kildare last year, actually about this time last year. Of course, what you can see here is not medieval. It's much later than that. And I do have a picture of a round tower that I'll throw up later, which is later medieval, but not the time that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to start out with giving a little bit of background with Saint Brigid, and then we're just going to launch into sort of beer history in Ireland. Saint Brigid is one of my favorite saints. Possibly because she sort of forged her own identity in terms of her sainthood. So she's sort of well known for stealing everything in sight. When she was younger, she stole everything from her father and her stepmother. Anything that she could get her hands on, she liberated from her father's house, and she ran off with these things only so she could give the money and food to the poor. And as you can imagine, this particular penchant for the 5-finger discount didn't particularly thrill her family. And so her father tries to sell her into slavery. And while he's trying to sell her into slavery to the king, he leaves his very expensive, very valuable sword with her. And she does what one would expect to do. She steals it and gives it to a leper. So, interestingly, the king concludes that it is precisely because she is entirely unapologetic about her thievery that she is very holy. To which he asks her if she would steal his wealth and cattle. And she replies, "The Son of the Virgin knoweth, if I had thy might with all Leinster and with all thy wealth, I would give them to the Lord of Elements." So she's going to steal from everyone and anyone. And it's interesting because while many saints are venerated as beacons of some stringent morality, she kind of she makes up her own rules. And one of the other things she gets up to, she's not just stealing everything, she's exploding eyeballs. Well, one person's eyeballs. So she decided to take the veil and become a nun. And this went over like a lead balloon with a local nobleman who mocked her and antagonized her about her duty to marry. And she wasn't having any of this. So she thrust her finger into her eye, gouged it out, and handed it to him and said, "Here is the beautiful eye for you. I deem it unlikely that anyone will ask you for a blind girl." And then she exploded her own eyeball. And if that wasn't enough, she kind of got a little more fed up with him later and decided that both of his eyeballs needed to go. And so she exploded his eyeballs for his insolence. So I just wanted to kind of set her up a little bit so you have an idea of the kind of person that we're dealing with. Now, I'll get into a little bit later whether she was a real person or not, and if that even matters to us. So in between all of these sort of behaviors that Bridget is getting up to, importantly for our purposes, is that Bridget was turning water into beer. And she was brewing in both a miraculous way and perhaps a more mundane version. So we're going to take a look today at what Bridget's Brewing, and what this tells us about monastic brewing in Ireland. And we're also going to do some comparisons to lay brewing in early medieval Ireland. So as the title of my talk today, a druid, a goddess, and a saint walk into the brewery. What sounds like a setup to a terrible joke is in fact the fascinating origins of this famous figure, who is a possible amalgamation of all three figures, the saint, the goddess, and the druid. And we'll begin this tale of one of the most famous women in Irish history with her stories of brewing. So there are three key works that I'm going to pull from to talk about her beer history. And the first is the life of Saint Brigid, and it was written by a monk in Kildare in the 7th century. And this was written about over 100 years after she died, and all of the sources that we're going to be using are written so much later. And I think it's really important to highlight this because we're definitely going to be working with things that we're not really sure are particularly reliable. Can we say that this for sure happened? This is why some scholars would argue that even believing in Saint Brigid is a leap of faith. But whether she exists or not, the history of brewing and the way that brewing is talked about that she engaged in is a really important insight into early medieval Ireland. There's two other sources that I'll probably talk about. One from the 9th century, Bethu Brigite, and the Vita Prima Sancta Brigite, whose date of composition is somewhat contentious. So without further ado, I'm going to get into some of her brewing stories. So in the second half of the 5th century, Bridget founded the monastery in Kildare. Of course, this is not at all it. And so at this time, the nuns gathered together around Easter at this newly formed monastery in Kildare, which means the Church of the Oak. And they came from all over Leinster to follow this nun, Saint Brigid, who was so pious and holy that she was, according to her hagiographers, accidentally ordained as a bishop. And so it's in her presence that these nuns now found themselves. And Easter was fast approaching, and Bridget gets this great idea that she wants to brew beer because the bishop is coming, and it's the Easter ale festivities coming up, and a lot of these were associated with ale feasts. And this tradition actually still carries on today. Franciscan Well Brewery in Cork has the Franciscan Well Easter Ale Festival every year. So here in Kildare, these nuns were deeply concerned because how are they going to supply ale for themselves and, in some stories, 17 churches? So Bridget decided that she was going to make this brew. And whether this happened or not, we don't know. Likely it was an interesting plot point for her hagiographer as evidence of her holiness, but no matter. The nuns now found themselves with 1 vat, 2 tubs, and 1 bushel of malt to make all of this ale. And never mind that it had to ferment almost instantly. So Bridget has the nuns bring all of the things to her. And I'm going to read the quote to you. Low Sunday approached. I do not think it fortunate now, said Bridget to her maidens, not to have ale on Low Sunday, for the bishop who will preach and say mass. As soon as she said that, 2 maidens went to the water to bring in water, and they had a large churn for the purpose, and Bridget was not aware of this. When they came back again, Bridget saw them there. Thanks be to God, said Bridget, God has given us beer for our bishop. The nuns became frightened then. May God help us, O maiden. Whatever foolish thing I said, I have not said anything evil, O nun. The water which was brought inside, because you have blessed it, God did what you desired, and immediately it was changed into ale, with the smell of wine from it. And better ale was never set to brew in the whole world. The 1 churn was sufficient for them with their guests and the bishop. So she's easily taken command of the situation, and she made this instant ale that was caused by blessing this water. Um, and later, this event, in some of the stories about her, and there goes my green screen. When Easter was finished, she decided that she wanted to brew more ale. So with that, more water was turned into ale forthwith. And so what's particularly interesting for our purposes is that her brewing and providing ale for the people around her was not mentioned as some remarkable task. Indeed, the only thing that's miraculous is the amount that she was able to produce, and that she was able to produce it. So this marks no strangeness in this event at all. And this likely implies that at one time, the time of composition, women in monastic communities were perhaps brewing. And this might also translate to lay women as well. So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, because I'm going to be focusing on monastic communities for a little bit, I do want to kind of disabuse you of the notion that these monasteries were tranquil communities of pacifists. Now, I know many of you might be aware of this already, but the monastic communities in Ireland absolutely went to war with each other. So specifically, Kildare sacked the monastic community at Tala in 824. The vice abbot of Kildare died fighting the Vikings. And in 807, Cork went to war with Clonfert, and one of the kings of Munster was also a Caliday monk. So we know that these weren't these bastions of mild-mannered people contemplating the vagaries of life. They were also capable of a lot of violence. And I say that because I want to kind of put this sort of in perspective when we're talking about these sort of monastic communities, what kind of people that we are communicating about. And so we do know that brewing in nunneries was common practice throughout the continental Europe in the early medieval period. Scholars such as Richard Unger investigated this production and found that abbesses in particular might have made small beer or weaker brews. And he specifically remarked on a story about a head of a nunnery who brewed beer that was so saintly, it was miraculously turned into wine. And we have lots of examples of nuns consuming beer. And one of my favorite stories that I'm going to share with you today is of Sister Euphemia and her demons. So in what is literally described as a dark and stormy night, Sister Euphemia found herself unable to sleep. And she was lying awake in her bed, and she saw what appeared to be her two best nun friends. But she was slightly unnerved, and they called to her and they said, "Sister Euphemia, get up, come with us down into the cellar that we may draw the convent beer." She was suspicious of them, not only because of the unusual hour at night, but mostly because they were talking to her, which meant they'd broken their vow of silence, and she knew her best friends would never have done that. So she knew right away that they were demons. So she got very, very frightened, and she decided to just whip the covers over her head and hid underneath them as the night passed, waiting for them to go away. So we do know that we have way more stories. I'll share another one briefly. Abbess Sophia, she was zealous and unbending in discipline, to the point where she apparently annoyed everyone around her, except for God, who was delighted. And because of this, he turned her beer into wine. So we do know that women were brewing and consuming beer in monastic communities. And we also have actually clear statutes talking about nuns and how they should brew. So we have a source dating closer to Brigid's time, around the 7th century, which states that one of the defined modes of work to be undertaken every day, except for feast days, was of course brewing. And it was important that they have an elder sister on hand to supervise the brewing process, so no unseemly behavior took place, like talking. So we do know that nuns were brewing in Europe, and that women brewed in these monastic settlements may also be supported by the ideology of women brewing in early medieval Ireland more generally. And these stories suggest that, at least at the time of their writing, the authors were familiar with women in this role. In particular, Her original hagiographer, from the monk from Kildare, did not have any Irish saints' lives to work with, so he was possibly using situations that would have been familiar to him and the people surrounding him in order to solidify her sainthood. That she made this miraculous ale was something that seemed not so far beyond the pale, and perhaps because women in monastic settlements were brewing to some degree or another. And so we know it wasn't just nuns that were brewing. Of course, we know that monks were brewing to some extent as well. So one of the most, probably the most famous saint out of Ireland is Saint Patrick. And he had his own brewer by the name of Meskin. And actually we have Meskin Brewery in Ireland now, and they make Belgian style beers, very good Belgian style beers, but they are of course still brewing in the Irish tradition. And so we have lots of interesting anecdotes from monks regarding beer. And just a brief, interesting one. We have two Kelly Day reformers, one from Tala and one from Finglas in 8th century Ireland. Now, this was pre-Dublin. So Dublin is a Viking city, and this is pre-Dublin. So Finglas and Tala. And these are areas in the modern Dublin sort of area now. So these two reformers had very high social standing, as did the monasteries at Tala and Finglas. And they were very prominent. They were actually referred to as the eyes of Ireland. So the monastic communities that they were from put an emphasis on individual piety and a rejection of the world. Important to our purposes is their competing thoughts on the consumption of beer. They believed that in general, the consumption of food was sinful. So there was not to be enjoyment with drinking or consuming food. Now, this is where it gets a little interesting and amusing for our purposes. The two reformers had a bit of a row over the place of beer in their community. So the reformer from Finglas argued that beer should be allowed to be drunk by members at certain times. And the reformer from Tala vehemently opposed this idea and would not consider it in the slightest, because beer equals enjoyment, which equals sin. However, the Finglas reformer quipped back that, quote, his monks would enter paradise just the same. However, we do know that even when the Tala monks traveled, they would have been able to drink beer. And we do kind of wonder how many went on pilgrimage just to have a pint or two. So we even have a legal tract which states that there are limits on the quantity of ale that could be drank. So 6 pints perhaps for a layman and 3 for a clergy member, so they don't get drunk. But Saint Brigid wasn't just tied to beer and brewing in this one incident. There are several stories involving her and miraculous ale. So we also have further examples of her creating beer from water to miraculously cure her sick foster mother. And this is just sort of filling a vessel out of a well and bam, instant beer again. So this is really what Brigid is doing. And we see this kind of going later on. And I'm going to go up into the High Middle Ages, and this is the only kind of foray I'm going to make up there. But in the 11th century, we have an old Irish poem called Saint Brigid's Ale Feast. And when she is asked what her view of heaven, she replied, quote, I would like to have the men of heaven in my own house, with vats of good cheer laid out before them. I would like to have a great lake of beer for Christ the King. I'd like to be watching the heavenly family, drinking it down for all eternity. And in other versions, she has heaven as a giant lake of beer with everyone, all the people of the world consuming it for all eternity, which sounds rather nice. So this kind of reinforces the idea that beer had an ale, I should say specifically ale, had a place of pride in medieval Ireland. And we do know that it was socially important. Scholars such as Cherie Peters have argued that beer was part and parcel of a meal fit for nobles or kings. And we know that the Irish held ale and brewing in high esteem within their cultural rituals. We know that a chief can demand ale and food as part of his restitution. And the legal tracts also state that, quote, a chief is entitled to ale and boiled salt meat. Ale is also clearly part of fines and restitutions that are paid for various offenses. Ale was seen as an expression of hospitality, and providing good ale for one's guests and clients was seen as a mark of honor. And so we have a series of early Irish laws, the Sencas Mór, and they offered a detailed glimpse into what the importance of ale might have been in this society. So there is a lot of pressure put on tenants to the chief or their king or their lord on providing good ale for those people, but also for guests that they are hosting. Now, one of the ways in which Ireland, early medieval Ireland, tried to control the quality of ale was having so many rules about the quality of malt. And in fact, they have lots of law tracts on malt and what malt should kind of look like. So Catherine Sims translated one of them, that there are 3 tests for malt. So one test is after it's dried but not yet milled. One test after the milling. So in this case, one makes like a cake to kind of study its taste and the digestibility of the malt. I actually did this when I was making a malt tonic. Part of the recipe was making this sort of a cake, and it was a really interesting process. And so this is part of this medieval malting test process. And so then the final test was in the courtyard. So the theory is that after it was brought to the Lord's courtyard, this is when the Lord's brewer or the chief's brewer would have assessed the malt one last time. So if all of these tests had been passed successfully, then the person who was making the beer was quite free from liability of any subsequent damage or deterioration that might occur in the remaining stages of brewing. So that's when the wort is boiled, then cooled, and finally coopered into beer casks. So all of these laws really focused on the malt because those are the things that they can control. They're not really able, of course, as we know, to have the kind of temperature control or the control of the yeast, infections, things like that. So they worked really hard to control what they could control, and then removed liability from the brewer and from the host later on. Because if the host gave beer that they knew was bad, they could have fines, quite hefty fines, that they would have to pay to who they served it to, particularly if they served it to their lord. But if they had gone through all of these tests, then they were exempt from those fines. So we do know that this is a really important part of brewing process, and they did spend quite a lot of time talking about bad ale and the consequences of knowingly serving this bad ale. And so we also know that beer was really important because of some of the other laws regarding entitlements to ale. So ale was viewed as an essential entitlement for the sick if fruits and vegetables were not available or a physician recommended the brew. So the author of the Corpus Juris Hibernici said that the smell of malt could trigger a pregnant woman's desire for beer. And a woman who was expecting was supposed to be able to have access to any of the food that she was required. So she was allowed to access this beer. So, and this has been echoed with a lot of scholars in Ireland. So perhaps all those Guinness is good for you marketing campaigns weren't so far off, at least in medieval Ireland. So we do know that if a pregnant woman wanted something that referred to it as a longed for morsel, she must have access to that. And there is this idea that perhaps these laws were in place because a baby's father might have unintentionally, or intentionally, I should say, withheld food to induce a miscarriage. So we also know that pregnant women wanting or needing access to beer is found in literary tales. So we have the story of the mother of a famous Irish satirist. and she was heavily pregnant with him at the time, and she entered the house of the king and pleaded with his brewer for beer, and she was refused 3 times. And at this point, the child she carried, he made a spell so powerful that all of the casks burst open and the ale flooded the floor, reaching upward of their ankles. And so she was able to drink as much as she pleased. And I guess that will teach them to get between a pregnant and her woman and her cravings. We also know from the Crith Galach that a king who could not provide beer every Sunday was viewed as not a fit ruler. We know from these texts that a lord's clients were to provide him with malt for beer as part of their annual food rent. And so we definitely have quite a lot of information for the place of beer, and particularly malt, in early medieval Ireland. And many scholars have argued that professional brewers were quite high status. Large households, such as the king or monastic orders, probably had their own brewer. And we do see this later on in the later medieval period when women are really dominant. And we see most legal tracts referring to women as brewing. We do see some monastic communities having their own brewers, but that's a talk for another day. So a lot of scholars, because the idea that these high status brewers were male, haven't really thought much about women brewing in not as high status positions. But I would argue that it is likely that women brewed on a household level, like they brewed in other countries at that time, because of just it being a household chore. So perhaps, again, high status brewer is a male, and in your own home, women are it's perhaps a female task. So that is a contention that I would make. And we do know that women, of course, were brewing elsewhere, as we have seen in the cases with the nuns, and of course we know in England. So we do know that they must have developed a highly sophisticated system for its production, at least in the high status level. So what does this beer taste like? Do we have any idea? What did they make it from? And we can have some guesses about what this might have looked like. So we do know that Irish literati on the continent complained about continental ale. We know, for example, there was an Irish scholar who was traveling through Liege in the 9th century, and he wrote home just to give out about the fact that he could only get very poor, very bitter ale for his money. So the idea has been put forth that Irish beer would perhaps be a little bit sweeter than the continental beer. But there's quite a strong point that there would be many different kinds of ale being made within Ireland. And we do have a poem actually from that was dedicated to a Scottish prince that was killed in 687. And this poem mentions many different types of ale. And of particular importance is that it talks about, quote, the Saxon ale of bitterness, and, quote, red ales like wine are freely drank, amongst loads of other different ales that it talks about. Now, I talk about the red ale and the Saxon ale, and I highlight those two for you today, because the inclusion of the Saxon ale and the bitterness of the Saxon ale has led to some scholars to postulate about the inclusion of hops in these brews. But this poem, of course, doesn't actually answer what they would have brewed with. So and then red ales, like wine, are freely drank. And this is something else that has caught a lot of scholars' eyes. And we do see later on in late medieval period, this idea of a red ale kind of coming forward and continuing. But what were Irish brewers using in the place of hops? Well, we don't really know. In the 19th century, O'Curry postulated that perhaps buckbean might have been used. We know bog myrtle was used elsewhere, or sweetgale. Scholars have also argued that they didn't use anything, that there might have been two different kinds, an ul versus a curum, one including just the wort with no bittering herbs, and one that would also have the bittering herbs. So we're not entirely sure. As for the malt, barley, likely, but rye was held in very high standards. So it is possible that because rye was highly prized, it might have been included in more high status ales. We also know that spelt and oats were used. And there definitely is an influence as the Middle Ages progresses with Irish and later with the Vikings coming, the Vikings influencing their beer styles and how they might have brewed. There is something about a Viking ale with being brewed with heather, but this is of some speculation. This might just have been a myth, and I'm looking more into that as we speak. So the moral sort of my talk today is that women were certainly brewing in medieval Ireland. Saint Brigid's story provides sort of a backdrop with which to examine medieval brewing in monastic and lay communities in Ireland and make some reasonable guesses and some speculation about what that would have looked like in the everyday life of women in the Middle Ages. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Christina. Certainly, if anybody has any questions, thoughts, comments, I welcome you to chime in and unmute yourself and ask those questions. There are definitely a couple questions that were a little earlier on in the chat as well. A while ago, you were talking about various malt laws, and Doug asked what the source for those malt laws might be.
Yeah. So it's the Sencus. Well, actually, I can send it to him. I am happy to send that. But yes, it's these early medieval law tracts. It's the Sencus More. So yeah, there's quite a bit in there, and that's where I get the majority of my laws.
Is there? I wonder. I haven't scoped around on your blog a lot. I don't know if you have like references and such on there as well for people.
Yes, I reference everything. I can't help myself.
Sure, you know. I'll post a link to your blog in the chat box as well if anybody wants to delve into that.
Oh, and I see a question. How do you make a malt cake?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So basically, I'll talk about the one that I made for my malt tonic. Basically, I mixed rye malt with just a typical base malt, and with water, and kind of let that kind of soak. And then you want to let it soak overnight. I did, at least. And then you form them into kind of like cakes. And I actually decided just to go ahead and line the bottom of the cookie sheet with it. And then I baked it on low for 2 hours, I want to say. And then they came out and it turned quite brittle. And I just then broke it up into pieces, because you could have formed them into cakes. And in fact, the 19th century recipe kind of suggested that, but I didn't really see a point to forming specific cakes because they were just going to be shattered anyway. So I just lined the bottom of my cookie sheet with it. And then, basically got shards of this sort of malt cake, and then off into the brew it went. Does anyone have any other questions? I'm going to type the source for the law tracks in the chat. But if anyone has any more questions?
If nobody chimes in, I'm going to keep asking my question. You were talking about how there's a conception that high status brewers would be males often, and then for the woman brewer is commonly considered more of like a domestic kind of household chore or such. But then I wonder also in medieval Ireland if we do find for any like commercial women brewers, is there a like a propensity, like was it just more conducive in the laws that more for I think I've read in some sources that often it was more widows or spinsters who would typically be more the commercial women brewers, but not so much married women? Or is there any evidence that backs that up, or am I
No. So Ireland's actually quite different than other places. So I'm talking about really, really early medieval Ireland here. But to answer your question, I'm going to go middle and later, high and later, Middle Ages. So we know that women who are married were brewing in medieval Ireland, and we know that women were the commercial brewers. So King John has a statute in 1301, I've made that up, 13 something. And he is only referring to female brewers in his statute. They have to pay this thing called the toll, which is a tithe in ale to the local cathedral. And as time goes on, in the 1300s and 1400s, we only see references to female brewers, and this is on a commercial sense. These brewers, they're talking about their portions and how they should apportion their beer to be sold, and subsequent consequences of selling beer, or I keep saying beer, selling ale, that is unhopped beer, in measures that do not align. And of course, a lot of these laws are more suggestions and actual necessarily enforced, so we're not entirely sure exactly, what that would look like in the day-to-day. But some of these things would have involved, if they broke the law and they sold these incorrect measures, could have involved corporal punishment. And so we have these consistently. Now we do have occasionally a reference in the 1400s, the late 1400s, to male brewers, but then it goes back again to female brewers. And I'm actually going to venture further down the line to talk about this to the early modern period, because we actually have a man by the name of Barnaby Rich who was a captain in the wars in the Low Countries and also was involved in the colonization of Ulster. And he decides to retire in Dublin. And he writes this text called The New Description of Ireland. And he is, to say unflattering about Irish people would be an understatement. He refers to them as cannibals and all sorts of other horrible things. But he goes on a tirade about women who brew. And he said something to the extent of, no housewife isn't a brewer, and no brewer doesn't have a tap house. And a lot of other scathing remarks, and just the amount of women brewing at this time is just overwhelming. And they all have these taverns that they're brewing out of their houses, and they're selling this beer, and they're selling this ale, and they're selling beer as well, because he does make the distinction between ale and beer. So they are making money. They are selling this, and they're selling it in quite larger numbers. It's interesting because in London we see, after the Black Death, beer brewing and ale brewing consolidating in less and less, but also male hands. Whereas in Ireland at the same time, we actually see more female brewers than were earlier. And we know this because the brewers actually go to the mayor, because as I had mentioned earlier, that case with the toll, that tithe that they had to pay to the cathedral, and they decided that there were too many brewers now, not brewing the same high amounts that they used to brew. This is not affordable anymore. We can't do this. And then the mayor sides with the brewers and says, no, you don't have to pay that anymore. There's too many of you. You're not brewing at these high capacities like you used to. You're brewing in smaller amounts, but you're still selling. So we do know that we actually have more women brewing later than we used to, which is a completely different situation. than we have in England. It's just a completely different scenario. I hope that answers that question a bit.
Yeah, thanks. No, interesting. That's really neat to see how there's just, an increase of women brewers in Ireland, whereas predominantly across the rest of really much of Europe, it seems to go in the other direction.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And Barnaby Rich actually, when he wrote that kind of scathing remark, he actually didn't get away with it. It went over so poorly that he had to write an apology book several years later, and he spent a lot of time talking about, oh, I'm so sorry, I wasn't talking about all female brewers, I was just talking about the bad ones. But brewing for housewives is a really good thing, and it's okay that you're selling it, but not the bad ones. So he really has to eat his words. It's really interesting study, because a lot of the writings on alewives in England, for example, are really scathing, and there's no backtrack on that, whereas it just does not go well in Ireland for him at all.
Scott's asking in the chat room to just remind us what years we're talking about again here.
So I've kind of jumped around, so I'm so sorry, Scott. Originally my talk was focusing on early medieval Ireland, so that would have been 400 to about 800, 900 is where I'm originally focused. And now I'm talking about more high Middle Ages. So once we're talking about England getting involved and that sort of thing, we're really talking 1167 and above. And then Barnaby Rich is coming in 1610. So I've really kind of jumped here, and I am sorry about that. But I did have to jump in order to compare, because unfortunately we don't have a lot of medieval sources because they were burned in the early 20th century in Ireland. So we kind of have to take these much later sources to kind of speculate about what was happening in the Middle Ages, because we just don't have the source material. So as medievalists, that's what we have to do. So sorry for the bit of jumping around. How many different languages are my sources? Latin, Old Irish, and Old Norse are the primary languages that of course English as well, but the primary languages.
There was another question from Juan, and you kind of touched on it a little bit when you're talking about how women brewers would sell their beer to taverns, but specifically asking as far as when we're talking about commercial brewers, is this being brewed or sold at a single pub or tavern, etc., or do we see commercial brewery that is distributing to several pubs or taverns?
Right. So this is largely speculative, but it does kind of seem like largely they're just selling out of their own houses, or their own houses, quasi taverns, their own properties. They're not really distributing to a lot of other places. Now, that is not necessarily the case across the board, because we do know that there's a woman in Kilkenny that was selling beer underneath the bridge for years and years. So they're not necessarily just selling at their houses. And that's something that I'm kind of digging a little bit more into, but that's a good question. Anyone else? Am I off the hook?
I do have one more question myself. I was thinking about, you mentioned at some point just a real passing reference to a king's obligation to provide beer.
Yeah.
And that just got me thinking about beer distribution in medieval Ireland, to what extent it was sold through a private individual, how much was it the part of the monastery or the nunnery to provide for the community, or how much was it really like a top-down distribution from the monarchy?
Yeah, so we have like early medieval Ireland is really it doesn't have a centralized power like other, well, it's a lot of small powers. So you have high kings and lesser kings and lords and underneath that. So not necessarily a centralized power island wide. That is sort of mythical. More likely a small central power. So a small king that would have clients, and the clients would provide the malt, and then the king would provide beer back. But it's also likely that these people were brewing in their own houses. Sherry Peters talked in depth about the entitlements of some lower classes of people to beer, and largely speculated that because of these entitlements, it was likely that they were brewing in their own houses. But the higher clients would have provided malt to their king, and then he would have provided beer, or ale, I should say, back. And this is part of their sort of their clientage. And yes. Brewing vessels. We do from later medieval. Actually, I shared this on Twitter a little bit ago. The National Museum of Ireland has what is probably one of the largest brewing vessels. And actually, I can find that for you, Doug, if you want again. But it's huge. But those are later medieval, but still really interesting. So we do, the museum definitely has some stuff like that. They also have jugs and drinking horns and all kinds of stuff. So lots of really good stuff at the National Museum of Ireland. Do you find ingredients? We don't really know what they used in Ireland yet. It's so speculative. So ingredients that are more specific to ale brewed in Ireland than in other places. We're largely guessing at this point. So no, there have been some really good studies on comparisons between, for example, bog myrtle and hops, and places that grew bog myrtle and places that had hops as well cultivated beer ingredients or ale ingredients, actually, well, beer ingredients actually. But we're really just speculating in Ireland. Now, TJ Fewer did some really good work on sort of narrowing down what beer might have been in later medieval and early modern Ireland. But again, which is what I talked about with probably adding oats and things like that. But again, this is largely speculative. And we do know that there was a very strong divide between ale and beer in Ireland, and that really lasts into the early modern period. Particularly, we can see it very strongly in the 1641 rebellion and the association of beer with Englishness and ale with Irishness, and they kind of take these two parallel tracks, and the way that they talk about ale and beer and the associations with both of those drinks, really interesting. But that is a very big tangent. Most of it would probably have been drank immediately or pretty quickly. That's the general speculation. It's the same with Viking beers, and that's kind of what we're guessing, but we're not entirely sure. If they're coopering it, if they're putting it in barrels, it's possible that they drank it on longer periods. But like if they're that fussy about malt and they're aware that this is the part that they can control, and they might have had some idea that the longer it lasts, the more likely that it could go off. But we don't know. It's definitely something I can kind of dig around to. No, hops are not indigenous to Ireland. At least not in vast quantities. It is my understanding that they are not indigenous when I've been talking to people that forage here. I think they're here now. There's the same case with like a lot of other things that have been brought here, but I don't think that they were native at the time.
This may be kind of tacky, but how and when do we see the real emergence of when we think of Irish beer, stouts and such like that? When does that really come onto the scene?
That's much later. So stout is so the sort of famous Irish red ale that we have now is really a riff on an English bitter, and then the stout is really kind of a much later 18th century sort of phenomenon. Though we might have had smoked beer, because there's some speculation that the Vikings had smoked beer. So it is possible that they brought that over with them. So, but yes, it's my understanding that hops weren't native to Ireland, at least in the early medieval period, but I might be wrong on that. But yeah, the modern Irish beer is quite modern.
What about around the same time, the periods that we're discussing here, other fermented beverages, wine and mead and whatever else?
Yeah, so mead, absolutely. Actually, there's a woman in Kinsale that's making mead, and she Kinsale Mead Company, and she actually is really interested in mead history. So her and I have been having chats and stuff, and so she's doing a lot with bringing sort of mead history to life, and that is a problem when researching Irish beer history, because there's so many different words for beer in Old Irish. So it is something that scholars debate. What kind of beer are they talking about? Are they talking about beer? Are they talking about something like braggot? Is it half beer, half mead? Is it beer that they've added mead to later? Is it beer that they've added honey to later? Have they added honey before the fermentation process? Have they added the honey after the fermentation process? Have they even added bittering ingredients? Does that make it just a wort-based beverage? Have they added this is the fun stuff.
All right. Well, if nobody wants to chime in with any further thoughts or questions, certainly I want to very much thank Christina for this very interesting presentation. Really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks so much for the great questions and thoughts and comments, everyone. We have a late entry here. Juan asking us what's the oldest actual liquid ale or beer found in Ireland.
So like do we have a bottle of something still? Like, do we have traces of something? Oh wow. We know that the Celts were brewing. Actually, there's a whole, if we're talking, I mean, we can go to prehistory with this, because there's a whole speculation about a thing called phylloxera, and which is sort of a heated stone kind of a brewing process. And this is something that archaeologists have been debating for ages. So quite much earlier than what I'm even talking about, we're probably having brewing in Ireland. And there's there's some really good work. The Moore Group, actually, out of Ireland, did a beer experimental brew using a phylloxera method.
Wonderful. Well, I'm gonna maybe wrap things up here. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Christina Wade, for this wonderful presentation, great conversation, very interesting, delving into medieval Irish brewing. And I want to let everybody know the next session coming up with virtual happy hour with the Chicago Brewseum on Thursday, April 16th, just in a few days, Thursday this week at 7 p.m. That is Central Time, Chicago time. Will be a history of point brewing. John Harry, a beer author and historian, author of Stephen Point's Brewing Company, is going to be hosting that session and discussing that. So hope you can join us for that. Let me post a link, of course, at chicagobrewseum.org/events. You'll find all of the virtual happy hours that we have scheduled and coming up. So always adding new things to the list. So be sure to keep checking back routinely. Thank you again so much, Christina, and thanks everybody for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the evening, and we'll hope to see everybody on Thursday.
And I've just popped my email and my Twitter handle down in the comments, so if anyone has any further questions or anything, feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.